Welcome, guys. It's been a while. We're on the 116th daf of Bava Kamma in the Gemara. And before I get into the Gemara share, and Kevin teaches us some essential Torah, um, prior to the Gemara share, I just want to dedicate the share to a good friend of mine who was also my bookkeeper for uh, uh, over a decade, Joyce Len. I just wish her family and her friends long life and condolences. Joyce had a fantastic sense of humor, and she was just very, very calm, generous, and very practical. Often I tend to complicate things, and she just make it quite clear, and took a lot of pressure off me over the years. And I appreciated her empathy for other human beings and her efficiency. It's all sometimes you have people that are nice and some people that are efficient. And Joyce was one of those that was both functional and good. And it's just so nice to have people like Joyce in the world. And I'm going to miss her as a friend. And certainly many of the accountants that I know that have expressed their condolences. I've been chatting with them. Obviously, just wish Joyce and her family long life. Kevin, do you want to teach us?
Yes. Okay, so last week's parsha was Parsha Tetzaveh, and that discussed begadim, the garments of the Kohen Gadol, and he put on he wore a tunic, then a robe, then an ephod with the 12 stones, then a headpiece, and it was anointed with oil. So my take on this is that for such an important avodah, I had to wear special clothes. So this is why we should try and dress smartly, and we do when we go to shul, when you go to especially on a Shabbos or for Hagim, etc. And I think my take is that that's why you try appear in your best when appearing before Hashem and prayer in shul.
I
And
agree. Yeah.
and the ephod, it hung over the shoulders. I thought of it the other day. I'll finish with this. It hung over the shoulders, and the 12 stones represent 12 tribes on it. I thought of it this other day. And to me, it's similar to what a talus is, the way you put a talus on. That's also a thought um, which I had.
Yeah, I never thought of it like that. It's true. It's absolutely true.
It looks very similar the way you wear it.
Yeah, that's true. Um,
Okay.
so what we're going to do is it's actually quite appropriate because not every time we do the Gemara share is there a new Mishnah. And Mishnah and Neshama have the same Hebrew letters. And often when somebody passes away, during prayers, we do Pikayavot or other Mishnayos to elevate their soul. So I hope this is an aliyah for Joyce's Neshama. And I'm going to, without any further ado, let's start the Mishnah before we go to the Gemara. So the Mishnah states, if one steals a field from his fellow, an extortionist, masikin, then take it from him, from the robber, the person who stole the field. This is the law. If it is a province-wide plague, meaning that the extortioners have appropriated the fields of others as well, the robber says to the owner of the field, behold what is yours before you. Basically, that's to say he's not liable for the loss of the field. But if the field was taken on account of the robber specifically, the robber is obligated to provide the owner with another field. Okay. Now I'm just going to explain the Gemara and what this actually entails. So the first thing that we're saying is there are different ways to steal your neighbor's field. It talks about a field because in those days it was a agricultural and agrarian society, at which you had farmland for both animal husbandry as well as for plants and crops. So one of the ways you could do it is by moving the boundary marker of the field adjoining your own, is one way to do it. Obviously, when you've got acres and acres of land, it's very, very expensive to put up fencing. So that generally within the Jewish community, there was a certain trust that the boundary marker would suffice both morally and legally. But you always have unscrupulous people in any community. So that's moving boundary markers. The other aspect, according to the Rif or Tosfot, is that you can forcibly occupy the field of another. And we call that in South Africa land appropriation, or what you call, you might have vagrants, where they, people that live on the street, and if a house is abandoned, they will just come and settle on that property, and it's very difficult to get them out. So those are one of the two ways that you can discuss it. So how can we not hold somebody responsible for stealing land? That's the first concept. And the reality is it's very difficult to, because land is, unlike movable property, it can't really be stolen. In other words, you can't physically move land. It always remains in possession of its true owner. Obviously, you have a legal issue where if a title deed is forged or stolen, then although the land doesn't physically change its location and can't be moved or sold as an asset, the title deed does hold the true power. But here we're talking about where the title deed remained intact at the deeds office or within the council of the Beis Din of Sanhedrin, and it was forcibly taken over, but it can't really be stolen. So we're saying now that the robber has been evicted from the land, he's not liable to pay for the theft. Why? Because if you've got, the term it's used here is, what happens if they're extortionists? Okay, so what do we mean by extortionists? In medieval times and prior, you had emissaries of the king, and what they could do is they could appropriate private citizens' land, because every bit of land technically belongs to the king. And therefore, what it's saying is, if there was a particular area demarcated by the king's men, or private group of bandits that took over and seized properties around that particular suburb, then we don't hold the robber responsible. Reason being is that this wasn't done to that person specifically. It was done to that area at which the robber happened to have been occupying at that time. So when the robber is booted out of his property that he stole, he's technically removed, but the property remains in its location. And what is assessed here is what caused it. If the robber caused the extortion because he owed debts, then it is his fault. If it's a province-wide confiscation, it's that even is beyond the owner's reach. All the robber has to do is basically withdraw from the land. And he said, listen, I've never taken your land. Your land remains exactly where it is. And even if the original owner had been there and it's been a provincial-wide confiscation, it wouldn't change if the original owner was on that property anyway. And therefore, he cannot be held liable. So that's what we're discussing. The other aspect of the case that we're going to be discussing in this Gemara, Arthur, I hope you're paying attention at any point. All right.
Those you showed me a picture. Just me have a look. The next one, you want to say later? No. Okay, no, okay. Bye.
Okay. So the other aspect of what you call robbery is not necessarily a case that we mentioned, but causing somebody's property to be stolen. So, for example, if you think you want to be helpful to extortionists and say to them, listen, I've got a property for you. It's the bomb. It's the most stunning property you've ever seen. It's got 5 bedrooms, bathrooms, and suite. Why is a person saying this? Well, basically, they know that there's an extortionist around town with a lot of power, whether it's the mafia or the king's men, etc. And he doesn't want his own property taken. And therefore, what he's doing is he's trying to show his fellows' property as a ruse to distract them from stealing his property. And therefore, that's also termed a robber. He never actually physically took possession of the property. What he did do is cause his fellow Jews' property to be confiscated through the extortionists. Okay, so that's another issue that's discussed in the Gemara, and we are going to just study a couple of words because you've got this issue of Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. Now I'm just going to share my screen if you guys give me 1 second. Okay. Okay. So, obviously in the Chumash, there's different ways that one can, in the commentaries, you can read and interpret words. So, the Gemara is basically saying that there are these two alternative ways to read the Mishnah. The one way to read the Mishnah, according to Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, is the one who taught the Mishnah is reading Mazikin. Okay, as you can see from the chart, wasn't in error. What does Mazikin mean, guys, from what you can see in the chart? Well, where is this reading? So if you have a look in Devarim, Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 53, the word Mazikin actually means oppression. Because what does the pasuk actually say? You will eat the fruit of your womb under the siege and the matzok, that your enemy will oppress you. So the word matzok means oppression, and mazikin means an oppressor, so to speak. So there's a whole connotation in terms of oppression. That's the one aspect. The other aspect is that if you identify with the later commentary of Devarim, Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 42, and not verse 53, it uses another term, and it says basically, all your trees and the produce of your land, the tzalatzal, will inherit. So what's tzalatzal? We say, look, the tzaka will inherit. Basically, these are terms for locusts. And why we say a locust is known almost as analogous to thievery is if if locusts descend on your farm en masse, they're going to pretty much leave it barren because they're going to eat all your corn and your fields, etc. So whether you're talking about almost referring it to your property, your fellow's property, to thieves, that's an obligation at which you're going to have to be responsible for paying. If there's an oppression where it's extorted, but they're extorting you because of debts owed, that's also your responsibility. So those are because why are we focusing on these different readings of matzikin or masikin is because everything in the Gemara on halacha has a biblical source in the Chumash. Obviously, the Gemara is the oral, the biblical is from the various pasuks in the Chumash. So the Mishnah states, if the field was taken on account of the robber is obligated to provide the owner with another field, whether it be the cash equivalent to another field. So we say, all right, according to the Gemara, what's this case in which the robber is liable to replace the field? And if you're going to use the term that the extortionist extracted the robber's field, but he didn't extort all the other fields in the vicinity, thereby indicating that the field was taken because it was in the robber's possession. We say that this cannot be the case. Why? Because that's obvious. If you want to look at the robber's liability in this case, you can learn it from the Mishnah's first clause. And what is that first clause, if you remember? I'm going to just share the screen a sec. It basically says, if there's a province-wide plague. So the Gemara is saying that you can read from the first section that if it's a province-wide plague and it's not because of the robber specifically, then the robber isn't held accountable because everybody in that district has had their fields appropriated to from the original owners. Okay, so what are we going to learn? We obviously have to learn something a little bit more. So we say the robber says to the owner of the field, behold, what is yours is before you, meaning I've been booted off the land, you can come to the land. And obviously that implies if the confiscation is not widespread and it's directed solely at the robber, he's not exempt, because if you say it's a province-wide seizure, then there is an exemption. If it's not a province-wide seizure and it has to do with a gambling debt, the robber is responsible. So why are we having the Mishnah's second clause? Because that seems superfluous. Why? Because it says he's not liable for the loss of the field. The field was taken on account of the robber. The robber is obligated to provide the owner with another field. So the Gemara is saying, why is the Mishnah mentioning this twice? And the Gemara is saying, look, they're teaching two different things. When the Mishnah speaks of a robber in the first case, it's actually referring to somebody that moved the boundary markers or had himself and his fellow friends hijack the property and stay on the property that didn't belong to him. When you're looking at the Mishnah's second clause, it's causing the extortioners to confiscate the property because the person is an informer, and what they're doing is they presenting the neighbor's field as their own in order that their own field doesn't get appropriated and taken. So how do we know this? Because there's another version of the answer. It says if you're dealing with the case of idolaters and they coerced the robber and told him to show them his lands, and he showed them the stolen field along with his own lands, in other words, the field that he has in addition to his own property, whereupon they confiscate the stolen field as well as his own, the Mishnah rules that since he caused the field to be confiscated, he must pay. Now, this might seem pretty obvious to you, but it's not quite so obvious, and we'll go through some of the reasons for this. Okay, so the first thing that you've got to realize is that there is a concept where if your life is in danger and you don't have to sacrifice money to save your life. In other words, if your life is in danger and they're going to torture and kill you, and you have to give up assets in order to do so, there are extenuating circumstances, so to speak. That's one of the considerations. The other consideration is that why on earth would you think that if the robber showed them the property of his fellow as well as his own lands, even if he was coerced by idolaters, that he shouldn't pay? Okay, granted, I mean, we've learned a case in the Gemara before that if you're dealing with a case where you damage property in order to save a life, one has to compensate for that property that they damaged. Okay, the life was worth risking in order to lose that financial damage, but it still has to be accounted for. So according to this version of the Mishnah, it speaks of one who robbed a field. And basically the cases where the extortioners forced him to show them his own lands. And then he showed them the stolen piece of property as well. So why does the Mishnah rule him liable? Because well, there are a couple of factors. The first issue to realize is that he had to be relatively clear with them that the field, he had to have disclosure with them that the field that he stole was stolen and what was distinguishable from his own fields. And as long as he explained that he stole the field and they didn't think it was his own, then if they're collecting a debt, then he's not causing his fellow's property to be lost. But if they're collecting a debt thinking that it's his field they're collecting, then that's not a province-wide search. It's a very targeted way to extract money for debts repaid. That's one issue. Then you've got another issue about this case of the law of Garmi and Groma. So let me just explain to you what Tosfos says. It says din dina Garmi, which means judging the law of Garmi. So what is Garmi? It's causative damage. So the Mishnah chooses to speak of this particular act of causative damage because of the novelty inherited in the law. Why? Because in most cases in which one is liable for causative damage, the perpetrator knows for certain that the cause will lead to the effect. In other words, if I have a kerosene torch and I set alight a barn, I know for the outcome is that I'm going to burn it a cinder. But if I'm having an act of informing the extortionist of my neighbor's fantastic looking property, I'm not sure if he's going to take the bait or not. And being at the fact that it could be a 50-50 that he does or he doesn't, in that particular case, am I really causing damage if it's not a certainty of the outcome? That's one aspect. The other, because they could choose to ignore the informer's suggestion. And then there's a second aspect according to the Tosfot, and that is that damage perpetrated through speech alone, without engaging in any physical activity, might not be considered culpability. So you can't look at the law today. There's obviously the law today has certain other effects. In other words, if you've got a mafia boss today and he gives, it's recorded on FBI tapes that he sanctioned a hit and an innocent person was killed, he will be held liable for the fact that his speech causes a person to die through a chain of events of cause and effect. However, initially it can't be held necessarily, according to the Torah, in the same regard as direct damage. In other words, the person that obviously shoots another individual is held liable. The reason being is there can be no agency through transgression, which means you know what right and wrong is. If you decide to take the contract to take somebody's life, the murderer is held liable because he's aware of the 10 commandments according to halacha, and thou shalt not kill. In terms of what happens indirectly with the law of Garmi, causative damage or indirect damage, is that person held responsible in the Beis Din? According to certain cases, no. Why? Because it uses the case of Sanhedrin. If you tie somebody to a pier on the ocean and you wait for the tide to come in, then in fact it's indirect, and you just tied him there. You never drowned him yourself. However, in the heavenly courts, they will hold that person accountable for murder. But in the earthly courts, there was this concept of needing evidence that a homicide, in fact, was committed. I think law did evolve where, in fact, causative damage is, according to many Talmudic opinions, is exactly the same as direct damage because the cause leads to the result or the consequence. Okay? So that's what it's dealing with here. Is that if, and how's this issue coming up into play? Very simply, if you physically seize the property of your fellow, then you have made a physical action to move boundary markers or have a hostile takeover and occupy that land. If you just inform extortionists that that property is lovely because you don't want your own property to be taken, there's certain Talmudic opinions that say that that is speech, number one, and it's not necessarily that the extortionist is going to take the bait from the informer. So it's not a guaranteed result. So is there liability? And our Mishnah is saying there is. For Garmi, causative damage, there is responsibility. Okay? Those who say it is a provincial-wide extortion, then there's no liability in that case, simply because whether the occupier or robber was on that property or the original owner, that property would be confiscated as a mandate to the greater suburb province from in the king's empire. That was beyond the control of the robber. And what does the robber actually physically taken? Nothing. He was just booted off the property that he stole, and then was said, well, what is yours is before you. Okay. Now, we're going to be dealing with an issue about is this considered a fine or is this considered a compensation? So I'll just tell you where we're going from this particular point. Is everything clear so far, guys? Yes? No? Okay.
Yeah, carry on.
All right, so according to the Yad Ramor in Shita Makobetzes, that in fact, one of the reasons the Mishnah requires the robber to pay, even if he has personal extortionists, is if they're coming after him specifically, he can't save his life with the property of his fellow, because he's the reason why they're taking the property from him, and he has to inform them that in fact this is not his land, he's occupying it originally, and the original owner has nothing to do with this collection policy for debts outstanding, okay, or gambling or anything of the like, and therefore is held responsible if he allows his fellow's property to be taken when the extortionists think they're his own. So the Gemara relates there's a certain man who showed the extortionist stores of wheat that were at the home of the exilarch, and they confiscated them. So let me just break down the sentence. Certain man showed the extortionist stores of wheat, and they were at the home of the exilarch, and they confiscated them. Now we're dealing with something slightly different. We're not dealing with almost, what do you call it, wheat that's stuck on property or stuck on the land. These are already harvested pieces, bales of hay or wheat or whatever the case may be. So what is the exilarch? Do you guys remember? Must I tell you? I'm sure you remember.
No, I don't. Kevin probably does.
Okay.
Leader
What's
of
it?
some sort,
Excel arc.
leader.
What did you say?
Yeah, so
Exilarch.
exactly. So if you've got an arch criminal or archetype character, it means somebody that's like pivotal. If you say you've got an archetypical character, it is the primary it's the primary sort of character or characteristic at which things are based. So the exile arc or the exile arch, as it could be pronounced, is in the times of exile, in the Babylonian exile, etc., you had a leader in the Jewish community that, although wasn't the leader in Eretz Israel, he was put in charge by the non-Jewish authorities. Like, for example, Rome had various vassal states, and he was in charge of the Jewish community as the attaché to both the Jewish community and the Roman Empire. He was, you could think of it today as an embassy, all on his own. So they would say this guy had a lot of money. This person showed the emperor's men the storehouses of this exilarch of the wheat, and they confiscated him. So if that was the case, why is he responsible? Because you could say, and maybe upon death they would have tortured him. And the Gemara says specifically, the Ramban, is that he wasn't obligated to show them. He wasn't being coerced. And that's why when the case came before Rav Nachman to be judged, Rav Nachman obligated him to pay. So Rav Yosef was sitting behind Rav Huna bar Chia, and Rav Huna bar Chia was sitting before Rav Nachman. Rav Huna bar Chia said to Rav Nachman, does this ruling emerge from the law of damages, or is it simply a fine? Okay. So what does that actually mean? Is that at the end of the day, Rav Huna bar Chia was unsure why Rav Nachman obligated the informer to pay. What do we mean? On the one hand, his ruling might have been normative application of the law of damages, which, guys, would mean that even causative damage by opening your mouth and informing on the field of a fellow Jew is what caused it to be confiscated, even though it's not speech and it's not direct. that would carry the exact same liability as damage directly inflicted, as if you stole the wheat yourself. That's one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is that the ruling was not based on the law of damages, but by way of a penalty or fine levied against this particular person because he was a chronic informer. We have to use the term chronic informer because in Babylon, they genuinely didn't issue a knas, a fine. There are compensatory payments yet, but not fine, unless somebody was a repeat offender. So we're saying, is this a case of a fine or compensation? Well, if you have a look, if you hold, for example, that there's no such thing as garmi, causative damage, because it's indirect or it's speech, or you're not necessarily sure that the extortioner will listen to you. In that particular case, those that hold that it isn't would, in this case, not see it as causative damage because they say you can't necessarily guarantee the results, or speech is not direct damage. So then the Rabbonim, that might not be biblical in nature, but it would be the Rabbanan, where the rabbis would hold that it's a kanas, a fine. Or you could hold that it's compensatory, meaning that if what you had to say cost your friend money, then you have to have compensation for the loss you caused him. And therefore, Brahma, indirect damage or causative damage, is exactly the same as if you yourself stole the money from your fellow Jew, irrespective of the percentage of the cause resulting in the action or the fact that it was indirect. So we need to know if it's a knas, a penalty, or a compensation. And you want to know why, for example. So you weren't the only one. Basically, what happens here is that Rav Nachman said to Rav Huna bar Chia, look, we've learned in a Mishnah that if the field was taken on account of the robber is obligated to provide the owner with another field or the cash equivalent, and the Mishnah has been established of speaking of someone who showed the field of another to extortionists. So we can see from this Mishnah that normative law demands payment from one who shows his fellow property to extortionists. Okay, so I just want to explain to you what that means. And if you have a look, let me explain it like this. Rav Huna bar Chia wasn't actually sure why Rav Nachman obligated the informer to pay. On the one hand, his ruling might have been a normal application of the law of damages, which means causative damage is paid. The other case, it might have been a fine. But we see from this that, let me just put it to you like that. I don't know if you guys know what normative tort law is. Guys,
No, I don't know.
All right, good. So let me show you, share the screen quickly, and we'll end off on this point. So
Maybe somebody else knows.
Normative tort law is the area of law that covers most civil suits. As you can read from the screen, in general, any claim that arises in civil court, with the exception of contractual disputes, falls under tort law. So the concept of tort law is to redress a wrong done to a person and provide relief from the wrongful act of others, usually by awarding monetary damages as compensation. So that's compensatory damages. And the original intent of tort law is to provide full compensation to prove harms. So is it normative tort law, or is it a penalty that, even though you don't have a mechanism to extract it because it's garmi, indirect or causative, as opposed to direct damage, is it in order to compensate the victors, or is it considered a case where it is a penalty to deter the offender from doing that particular act? And basically, when Rav Nachman left, Rav Yosef said to Rav Huna bar Chia, listen, basically, I don't get your question. because either way there's a payment that has to be made. What difference does it make to you whether Rav Nachman's ruling is based on the law of damages and compensatory in nature because it's normative tort law, or whether it's merely a fund? And Rav Huna bar Chia said to him, if it is normative tort law, we can extrapolate from this ruling, we can build a case and extend it to other cases similar in nature. But if it's a fine, then you can only generally apply it to a habitual damager, at which a penalty is even enforceable in Babylon, where a normal fine would not, because this person is a psychopath and seems to have a continual behavior like this. But you cannot extrapolate it to similar cases because it's particular in nature to this individual. So that's what we're dealing with here. Can we learn from this and put it to similar cases? Or is this a once-off issue that it's a fine only in the case of either a chronic informer or an informer is seen as not having created direct damage, either because the consequences, you're not sure if the extortionist would listen to you, or that speech alone is not seen as action. But either way, a fine is not implementable in similar cases, according to that opinion on Rav Huna bar Chia's assumption. Rav Yosef doesn't hold by that. He says, listen, it's very possible that you can take a situation where a fine is applied and use that application in similar cases. It doesn't have to be only compensatory payment with normative tort law. All right, guys, I hope it makes sense. We can finish on this note.
Yeah, got a good idea.
Okay,
Thanks, Damon.
it's not that hard. We're 2 or 3 dafs away from the end. Yeah.
Thanks. All right, yes, let's get there in 3 weeks. Let's do our best.
We'll do our best.